A 7-year-old boy sat by himself at the end of a long banquet table. Wearing a clip-on tie that was slightly crooked, holding a small paper cup of lemonade with both hands, like it was the most important thing in the room. Around him, 200 guests in formal attire laughed, clinked glasses, and posed for photographs. Flowers the color of cream and gold covered every surface. A string quartet played near the windows. Outside, the evening sky over Charleston had turned a deep bruised violet. It was the most expensive graduation party Harrington Preparatory Academy had ever thrown for a student, and the boy sitting alone at the end of that table was the reason any of it existed. His name was Eli. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with dark eyes that noticed everything and said very little. He had come with his father, who was somewhere across the room being congratulated by people whose names Eli could not remember. The tie had been Eli's idea. He had picked it out himself from a hook on the back of his bedroom door, a blue one with tiny white anchors on it, because his father once told him that you should always dress like you mean it when something important is happening. Eli had meant it. He had combed his own hair. He had polished his own shoes with the brush kept under the sink. He had done everything right. But the chair beside him had been empty for 40 minutes. His father's name was Kenneth Briard. He was 43 years old, a widower, and one of the most decorated criminal defense attorneys in South Carolina. He had spent the last 11 years building a reputation for taking impossible cases and winning them. He was the kind of man who entered a room and altered its atmosphere without trying. Tall, composed, silver beginning to thread through dark hair at his temples, with a handshake that people still mentioned months after meeting him. Magazines had profiled him. Law schools invited him to speak. Colleagues whispered his name the way people whispered the names of landmarks. Kenneth loved his son with the kind of love that does not know how to be quiet about itself, or so he believed. He had enrolled Eli in Harrington because it was the best. He had hired 3 different tutors because Eli deserved the best. He had planned this graduation reception because it was supposed to mark the beginning of something new, a transition from early childhood programs into Harrington's formal primary track. And Kenneth Briard did not mark transitions quietly. He did everything the way he did everything. Completely, precisely, at scale. What Kenneth could not see, standing at the far end of the room, accepting congratulations from Judge Patricia Wainfield and her husband, was that his son had stopped watching the door 20 minutes ago. Eli had been watching the door. For a long time, he had been watching it, half expecting his father to look up across the crowd and find him the way fathers are supposed to find their children in rooms. But it hadn't happened, and at some point, without deciding to, Eli had simply stopped expecting it. He set his paper cup down carefully on the white tablecloth. He folded his hands in his lap. He became very still. Children do that when they give up on being found. They go quiet in a particular way that adults almost never notice, because it looks, from a distance, like contentment. It was not contentment. Across the room, not far from where the catering staff was setting out the 3rd dessert course, a man named Ray Coulter stood holding a plate of food he hadn't touched, and watching the boy at the end of the table. Ray was 41 years old. He worked as an elementary school music teacher at Delacroix Public School, 3 miles from Harrington, and about 3 tax brackets removed from it. He was there that evening because his daughter Maura, who was 9, had been invited by a classmate, whose parents were connected to the academy in some way. Ray hadn't fully understood when he agreed to come. Maura was currently somewhere in the adjoining courtyard with a group of children, who had discovered a garden maze in the hedgerows. Ray had watched her disappear into it with the easy confidence of a child who makes friends the way other people breathe. Without thinking about it, without effort, as naturally as the next thing after the last thing. He had not stopped being grateful for that quality in her since the day her mother died. Maura's mother, Teresa, had passed 2 years earlier from a brain aneurysm. She was 38 years old. She had been making breakfast. Ray had been in the shower. He came downstairs and she was gone, in the way that the word gone does not begin to describe what it means, to walk into a kitchen and find your whole life rearranged, in a moment you didn't know was coming. He had stood in that kitchen for what he later learned was 40 minutes, before his neighbor heard him through the wall and called 911. After Teresa, Ray had spent a long time learning how to be both parents. He wasn't sure he had ever fully learned, but Mara had helped. She was the kind of child who told him when he was doing it wrong, and hugged him when he was doing it right. And somehow the combination of those two things had gotten them both through. He stood now with his untouched plate, watching Eli at the end of the table, and he recognized something. It was not pity, exactly. It was more precise than pity. Ray had spent 11 years watching children in classrooms, watching the particular geometry of who sits with whom, who gets called on, who volunteers, and who waits by the door at recess, hoping someone will wave them over. He knew what exclusion looked like when it was accidental, when it happened not because anyone decided to leave someone out, but because the group moved in a direction, and someone got left behind in the momentum, the way a current moves and an untethered boat does not. Eli was untethered. And either no one had noticed, or no one had stopped. Ray set his plate down on the nearest surface, straightened his jacket, and walked to the end of the table. He pulled out the chair beside Eli, and sat down, not in a way that announced itself, not with the energy of someone making a grand gesture. He just sat. The way you sit when you have nowhere else to be and the chair looks good. That is a very serious tie, Ray said. Eli looked at him. His expression did not change immediately, but his eyes did. They moved the way children's eyes move when they are deciding whether a stranger is safe, a rapid ancient calculation that happens faster than thought. It has anchors on it, Eli said. I see that. Are you a sailor? No. A pause. My dad says you should dress like you mean it. Your dad sounds like a smart person. Eli considered this carefully, the way children consider things when they are not certain. The statement is fully accurate. He knows a lot of stuff, he said, which was not the same answer, and Ray noticed the difference, though he didn't comment on it. I'm Ray, he said instead. Ellie, is this your party, Eli? The boy looked around the room for a moment. Take it in. The flowers and the string quartet, and the servers, moving through the crowd like slow-moving fish in a very well-dressed sea. Then he looked back at Ray. I think so, he said. It was supposed to be. There was nothing in those 5 words that Ray could have quoted as evidence of sadness. They were mild words, quiet words, the words of a child stating a fact about weather or geography. But something in the way Eli said them, the small pause before supposed, the careful way he looked at the table, instead of the room when he said to be, landed somewhere in Ray's chest and stayed there. Well, Ray said, in that case, it seems like the guest of honor should have someone to sit with. He picked up a small dinner roll from the bread basket in front of them and tore it in half. Do you like bread? Ellie almost smiled. Yeah, good. Because I have nowhere to be, and this bread is excellent. That was how it started. Not with anything dramatic, not with a speech or an intervention, or a moment that anyone across the room would have recognized as significant. Just a man and a boy, side by side at the end of a long white table, talking about bread. Ray asked Eli what his favorite subject was. Eli said math, and then corrected himself and said actually probably music, but his tutors he spent too much time on music, so he wasn't sure if he was allowed to say it was his favorite. Ray asked what kind of music. Eli said he was learning piano, but what he actually wanted to play was guitar, because guitars went places. Ray said that was a very good reason to want to play guitar, and that actually he taught music for a living. And Eli's eyes went wide, in a way that had nothing diplomatic about it. Pure unguarded surprise, the kind of expression children still have before they learn to manage their reactions for an audience. Do you actually? Eli said. I actually do. What do you teach? Right now I've got a group of 8-year-olds working on recorder, which I'll be honest with you is not my favorite instrument in the world, but we're getting there. Ellie laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, and he put his hand over his mouth after it happened, as if he hadn't expected it either. From across the room, Kenneth Breard did not notice. He was explaining a case strategy to a retired appellate judge, who had been trying to get his attention for 3 years, and the conversation was going well. And Kenneth was good at conversations that were going well. He had built a career on conversations that were going well. His assistant, a young woman named Becca, touched his elbow at one point. Mr. Breard, do you want me to check on Eli? I noticed He's fine, Kenneth said without looking toward the table. He's a resilient kid. Becca, can you make sure Judge Harmon has a fresh drink? Becca looked across the room at the small boy in the clip-on tie, and then back at her employer, and said nothing else. Ray meanwhile had learned the following things about Eli Briard: that he had been to 43 states because his dad took him along on work trips when school allowed, that he had a goldfish named Senator, because his dad said, you should name your pets after things that don't do much, that his mother had died when he was, which Eli mentioned in the same matter-of-fact way he mentioned everything, because it was simply a fact of his geography, the same way some kids grew up near the ocean and some kids did not, and that Eli had never once in his life been to a sleepover, not because no one had invited him, but because his father's schedule made planning difficult, and the invitations kept getting postponed until they quietly expired. That last one Ray filed away without commenting on. He told Eli about Maura, about how she was currently, as they spoke, probably winning a hedge maze competition she hadn't known was a competition until she decided it was. Eli said that sounded like someone he would like to meet. Ray said he thought Maura would agree. Is she your only kid? Eli asked. She is. Is it hard? Just one? Ray thought about how to answer that honestly, without making it heavy. Sometimes, he said. But then she does something that makes me laugh until I can't breathe, and I think, if I had 10 of her I couldn't hold that much funny. So maybe one is exactly right. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think my dad thinks I'm easier than I am. Ray looked at him. Eli was not looking back. He was looking at the paper cup he had been holding when Ray sat down, which was now sitting on the tablecloth between them. What makes you say that? Ray asked. He plans everything really well, Eli said. Like the food here is really good, and the flowers. He knows I like blue, so there's blue in the flowers. He pointed at a nearby arrangement, where thin blue irises threaded through the white roses. Ray hadn't noticed them before. But I don't know anyone here, and all the kids went outside and I don't know them and nobody asked me to come, so I was just sitting. He said it the way you say the end of a list, not with self-pity, just, this is the last item, sitting. Ray didn't say I'm sorry or that's too bad or anything that would have made the moment swell up into something Eli would have to manage, he said. The blue irises were a good call though. Ellie looked at them again. Yeah, he said, and something in his face settled, just slightly, the way a shoulder drops when someone stops bracing. It was around that point that Maura appeared from the direction of the courtyard, cheeks flushed, one ribbon from her braid completely undone, holding something small in her closed fist. Dad, she announced, I found a snail and I want to name it. You can't keep it. I know that, I just want to name it and then put it back. That seems reasonable, Maura. This is Eli. It's his party. Maura looked at Eli with the direct, unblinking appraisal of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned that staring is rude, or has learned it and decided it doesn't apply to important assessments. Happy graduation, she said. Do you want to see a snail? Ellie glanced at Ray. Ray shrugged, which meant your call. Yeah, Eli said. Maura opened her fist and there it was, a small brown snail barely the size of a quarter, moving slowly across her palm with the unhurried dignity of something that has never once been in a hurry and sees no reason to start. I'm calling him Gerald, Maura said. Why Gerald? Eli asked. He looks like a Gerald. Eli studied the snail seriously. Yeah, he said after a moment. He does. And then something happened that Ray would think about for a long time afterward. Eli laughed again, but differently this time. Not the surprised, startled laugh from before. A longer one, more settled, the kind that has room in it. And Maura laughed back, not at anything in particular, just because laughter is its own conversation when you're 9 and 7, and you're standing over a snail named Gerald at a graduation party on a Thursday evening in Charleston. Ray watched them and felt something ease in his chest that had been tight since they arrived. Across the room, Kenneth Briard finally looked up. He was not sure what made him look. A shift in the room's energy, maybe, or some parental frequency that activates at irregular intervals without warning. He turned toward the end of the table and saw Eli leaning over, looking at something in a girl's hand, and next to them a man Ray's age, in a jacket that had seen better days, smiling at the children with an expression so unguarded it was almost startling in this room full of careful faces. Kenneth excused himself from his conversation. He walked toward the table, not urgently, but with direction. He was halfway there when he heard his son laugh. The real laugh, the one from somewhere deep in Eli's chest that he hadn't heard in. Kenneth stopped walking for a moment and tried to count backwards. He could not arrive at a recent date. Weeks, certainly, maybe longer. The careful managed version of Eli's laugh, the polite performance of amusement. Kenneth heard that regularly. But this laugh, this one he had not heard in a while, and the distance between now and the last time it had happened, settled over him. In the middle of a graduation party he had spent $40,000 arranging, like cold water. He stood still for a moment, and watched. The girl with the undone braid was telling a story with her hands. Eli was listening with his whole body leaning forward. The way he used to lean forward when he was 4 and 5, and the world still felt like it was aimed at him personally. The man beside them was not performing anything, he was just there, easy and present in the way of someone who had nowhere else to put his attention. Kenneth thought about the last time he had sat with Eli like that. Not at a dinner where he was also thinking about 3 other things. Not in the car on the way to something. Sat with him, fully, the way that man was sitting, with everything else temporarily set aside. He could not find the memory, it was there somewhere, he was certain of it. But he could not find it in that moment, and the not finding was its own specific kind of pain. By the time Kenneth reached the end of the table, Maura was explaining the hedge maze to Eli in great detail, and Gerald the snail had been returned to his home in the garden, with the brief ceremony Maura deemed appropriate, which involved 3 seconds of silence and the words, "Godspeed, Gerald." Kenneth pulled out a chair and sat down. Eli looked at him. His expression was not accusatory, it was not cold. It was the expression of a child who has learned not to expect things at particular times, who has adjusted his internal schedule to accommodate the reality of his father's attention, and who receives it now, when it arrives, with a kind of careful neutrality that is, in its own way, more heartbreaking than anger would have been. "Hi Dad," Eli said. "Hi Bud." Kenneth looked at Ray. "Kenneth Briard, I think you've been keeping my son company." Ray shook his hand. "Ray Coulter, he's been keeping me company actually, I didn't know anyone here either." Kenneth looked at his son. Eli was looking at Maura, who was now explaining her theory of why snails move the way they do, which was detailed and largely incorrect and delivered with complete authority. "Is she your daughter?" Kenneth asked. "She is, she's something." "She really is," Ray said. "I had almost nothing to do with it." Kenneth almost laughed. It surprised him. He turned back to Eli and said quietly, "I'm sorry I was over there so long, Bud." Ellie looked at him. The neutrality in his face shifted only slightly, something below the surface moving. "It's okay," he said. "No," Kenneth said. "It isn't, actually." Ellie was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Gerald was a snail." "What?" "We named a snail. His name was Gerald. We put him back in the garden." Kenneth looked at his son, and his son looked at back, and something passed between them that did not need to be named to be understood. "I would have liked to meet Gerald," Kenneth said. "I think there are more snails," Maura offered, from across the table. "Snails are usually not alone." "That's statistically very likely," Ray said gravely. "We could probably find another one," Eli said. He looked at his father carefully. "If you wanted." Kenneth Briard, who had spent 20 years being the most prepared man in any room he entered, found himself entirely unprepared for that question, not because it was difficult. Because it was so simple. His son was offering him the easiest possible version of an invitation, "Come find a snail with me." And Kenneth understood, with a clarity that was uncomfortable in proportion to how long it had taken to arrive, that he had been declining versions of this invitation for a long time. Not with the word no, with the word later, with a glance across a room, with a phone call that couldn't wait, and a meeting that ran long, and a party that had cost $40,000 and still somehow missed the point. "Yeah," Kenneth said, "let's go find another snail." Ellie's face did something then. It didn't transform, not dramatically, not the way a face transforms in a movie, when the music swells and the lighting shifts. It was smaller than that, a fraction of tension leaving around his eyes. The faint reappearance of something that had been waiting at the edges, patient and stubborn. The way children's hope tends to be. They stood up from the table, all 4 of them, and walked toward the courtyard, past the string quartet and the dessert table and 200 guests, who paid no particular attention. Because 4 people walking toward a garden looks like nothing from a distance. It looks like exactly nothing. It was the most important thing that happened at that party. The garden was cool and dark past the lit pathway, with that particular nighttime smell of soil and greenery that cities usually suppress. Maura had a small flashlight on her keychain, a pink one shaped like a star, which she deployed with professional efficiency. Eli walked beside her, their heads bent over patches of garden bed, and Ray walked a step behind with Kenneth, and the two men were quiet for a moment in the way that men sometimes are when they have been moved by something and do not yet have the language for it. "How old is your daughter?" Kenneth asked. 9, she's incredibly kind. Ray thought about this. "She gets that from her mom," he said. Her mom was the kind of person who noticed people, like really noticed them, walked into a room and within 5 minutes knew who needed someone to talk to. He paused. "She passed 2 years ago." Kenneth looked at him. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Ray watched Maura crouch down and point at something with her flashlight. Eli crouched beside her, his clip-on tie swinging forward. "Eli mentioned he lost his mother young. He was 2, Kenneth said. The words were brief the ways some words are brief because expanding them costs too much. He doesn't remember her, but he knows her, if that makes sense. We talk about her. He knows her favorite color and her laugh, and the way she used to put hot sauce on everything." He paused. "I think I've tried to. I've spent a lot of time trying to give him everything else. Every possible thing that money and time and planning can give a kid. I think I confused that with giving him what he actually needs." Ray didn't answer for a moment. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because the statement didn't need to be agreed with. It was already true. It had been true before it was said. "They're very good at telling you," Ray said finally. "When you listen to the right things, Dad." Eli called from the garden bed. "We found 2. Are you naming both of them?" Ray called back. A brief conference between Maura and Eli. "Kevin and Denise," Maura announced. "Strong choices," Ray said. Kenneth was smiling. The real version, the one that didn't come from anything professional, that had nothing to do with impression management. He stood in the dark garden in a $1,500 jacket, and watched his son solemnly introduce himself to a snail named Kevin, and he felt something unclench in him that he had not been aware was clenched. It was not comfortable, the unclenching. It is rarely comfortable to discover how tightly you have been holding something. Later that evening, after the party had wound down, and the last guests had filtered out, and the catering staff was quietly dismantling the flower arrangements, Kenneth sat in the back of his town car with Eli asleep against his shoulder. He looked at his son's face. The clip-on tie had been placed carefully in the cup holder. Eli slept the way he always slept, completely, as if sleep were another thing worth doing all the way. Kenneth thought about the 40 minutes Eli had sat at the end of that table alone. He thought about Becca's elbow touch, and his own answer, "He's fine," delivered with such confidence. The confidence of a man who has planned everything correctly, and therefore cannot imagine that anything has gone wrong. He thought about a man in a worn jacket, who had sat down without fanfare, and talked about bread, and a little girl with a flashlight, and a complete theory about snails, and how all of it together had cost exactly nothing, and given Eli more than the entire event surrounding it. He did not have a clean conclusion about this. He was too honest with himself to manufacture one. What he had instead was a question he intended to sit with, the kind of question that does not get answered quickly, but gets answered eventually, the way a debt gets paid, incrementally and with sustained intention. The question was, what is Eli trying to tell me, and have I been listening to the right things? He did not have the answer yet. But he had the question, which is where most things worth doing actually begin. In the following weeks, Kenneth Briard began making changes. They were not announced. He did not call a press conference, or post about them, or discuss them with colleagues. He simply began doing them. He cleared his Thursday evenings, all of them, categorically, with the same finality with which he might have taken a case off his docket. Thursday evenings became Eli's. They cooked together, badly at first, with the kitchen looking like a crime scene, and Eli laughing at his father's complete incompetence with a rice cooker. They drove to the coast one weekend, and walked on the beach for 3 hours, and talked about whatever came up, which was an extraordinary range of things including Senator the Goldfish's apparent personality changes, the ethics of naming snails you intend to release, Eli's developing theory of guitar music, and a detailed if somewhat historically inaccurate account of whatever Eli had read that week. Kenneth also had a long conversation with himself about his son's school schedule, his tutor's instruction to spend less time on music, and how these two things fit together, when he held them next to the image of Eli's face when he talked about guitars going places. He made a call. The tutor's instruction was revised. Ray Coulter became someone they knew, not dramatically, not through any formal arrangement, just in the way of two families who have met at the right moment and found the meeting worth repeating. He and Maura came to dinner once, a real dinner, not a catered event, just food on an ordinary table. Maura brought her recorder, which she was borrowing from school, to practice over break, and played an extremely earnest version of Hot Cross Buns, while Eli listened with the expression of someone making serious musical assessments. Afterward, Ray sat at the piano in the front room and played for an hour, and Eli sat on the bench beside him and watched his hands, and at some point Ray just quietly shifted and let Eli's hands join his, showing him where to place them, and Kenneth stood in the doorway of his own house, and felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the particular piece of a moment that requires nothing from you except to be present in it. Eli began guitar lessons in the fall. His teacher was a young woman named Faye, who worked out of a studio on Morrison Street, and had the quality Ray had noticed in the best teachers he'd known, the ability to be genuinely interested in where her students were, rather than where she wanted them to be. Eli took to it the way children take to things they have been quietly waiting for. Within 3 months, he was playing simple songs through and through. Within 6, he was writing his own. The first one he finished, he played for his father on a Saturday morning in the kitchen, while coffee was brewing. It was short, less than 2 minutes, not technically complicated, with a chord progression he'd worked out by ear over several weeks. It didn't have words yet, but it had something else, a feeling in it, something deliberate and searching and glad, the sound of someone saying carefully, "I am here, I am here, I am here." Kenneth listened without moving. When Eli's finished, he set the guitar across his knees and looked at his father with that careful, waiting expression. "What do you think?" Eli asked. Kenneth thought about a boy in a clip-on tie at the end of a long table, and a man who sat down without being asked, and a snail named Kevin in a dark Charleston garden. "I think," he said, "that's the best thing I've heard in years." Eli looked at the guitar in his lap. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders dropped in a way that meant he had been holding something, and had now finally set it down. Some things do not need to be said to be heard. Some debts do not need to be named to be paid. And some doors, the ones that matter most, are never locked, only unknocked, waiting, as they have always been waiting, for someone to finally stop in the hallway and say, "I'm here, I have nowhere else to be. Can I come in?"